The drought had stretched 3 seasons past reason. Livestock lay with their legs stiff in the dust, their hides puckered tight like old drums. The prairie's once golden skin cracked open to reveal bone-dry earth beneath, and men's faces grew as hollow as their barns. Out in the flats north of Salado Ridge, the wind cut through cedar and mesquite, whispering of things taken and never returned. John Holt's boots made no sound as he walked across his land, what was left of it. Fence posts leaned like drunks, their wires snapped by horned skulls too stubborn to lie still. His hands, still scarred from the fire that had taken his home 2 winters prior, clutched a jug of kerosene. The outbuilding, the last structure not eaten by wind or debt, was next. He poured slowly, the liquid pooling like shadow, then stepped back with a match trembling between 2 fingers. He never struck it. The whinny of a horse and the distant clatter of wagon wheels paused his motion. He looked east, past the rise where dust always moved faster than reason. What he saw turned his blood cold and furious all at once. A covered wagon flanked by 3 riders, and at the front, riding tethered like livestock, was a woman, white dress mudded to the knees, wrists bound to the saddle horn, her long hair unpinned and snarled from the ride. She was young, pregnant, and her eyes, even from a distance, stared forward with the brittle clarity of someone who had seen too much. They were headed to Abilene. John had seen enough auctions in his life. He knew the price they fetch for a girl like that, especially one swollen with some bastard's child, especially one too dazed or too proud to cry. He let the match fall into the jug. Flames rose, then roared. He walked back to his cabin, loaded the Sharp's rifle, and saddled his mule, Esau. By the time dusk folded across the land, John was riding hard along the trade road, the same path where he'd buried his wife's bones 2 years before. The town was setting up when he arrived, crates stacked by the jailhouse, torch barrels lining the auction yard. Men drank behind the livery and eyed the cage cart in the square, and there she was, seated on a bench with her ankles shackled and a black bruise blooming along her collarbone. They'd cleaned her up to make her more appealing, combed her hair, cinched her dress just tight enough to show the shape of her suffering. John dismounted, tied Esau outside the post office. He approached the platform, rifle slung but loaded. "Name?" asked the clerk. "John Holt." "Buying or bidding?" "Buying." "Gotta wait till she's on the block, mister. No private sales." "I'm not asking for one." Behind the clerk, the sheriff glanced up. His lip curled when he recognized John. "You can't afford a goat, Holt. What are you doing here?" "Settling a debt," John said. They laughed, but the girl didn't. She looked at him like she knew something already about the way ghosts moved or how the desperate carried themselves. Her hands rested over her stomach like she was guarding what little was hers. The auctioneer stepped forward. "Lot 17, he called, tapping the brand iron against the wood. "Pregnant, healthy, likely 3rd term, no known diseases, formerly the property of Lyle Kavanaugh." "Formerly?" someone asked. "Dead," the sheriff grunted. "Slit throat in the canyons," said another. A few chuckled. John didn't. The bidding started low. A few leers, a few hoots. But no one wanted to pay full for something they couldn't break in. She didn't cry, not once. When they tried to pull her forward, she flinched but didn't fight. John raised his hand. They turned. 50, he said. 50 what? The auctioneer smirked. 50 acres. A silence fell. The clerk blinked. You have 50 acres. I've got the deed. You offering land for a bred-out whore, a man called. John stepped onto the platform. I'm offering what I've got for her. You take it, or I take her now. The sheriff stepped forward. That ain't how this works. John leveled the Sharps. It is today. In the silence, a baby cried somewhere. Then the wind kicked up dust across the square. The sheriff held his hands up, backing off. "She yours," someone muttered. John looked at the girl. "No," he said. She met his eyes. "Not yet." No one moved, no one dared. John unshackled her himself, lifted her down, and helped her to the mule. She didn't ask questions, she didn't thank him. She just held her stomach, mounted slow, and didn't look back as they rode out of Abilene like death itself was behind them. Back at the ridge, she didn't speak for days. Her name came out between coughs, Ruth. She didn't know who fathered the child, and she didn't want to. Lyle had taken her after her family starved out near Carson's Fork. She was 14 when he dragged her from the dirt, and 17 now, belly full and eyes older than sin. John didn't ask for details. He gave her the main bed, took the cot, and brought water from the well 3 times a day. She didn't eat much, just sat on the porch and watched the dying sun with a face carved from flint. But one night, after a storm broke, she stood in the doorway while John sharpened a knife and said, "Why'd you do it?" He didn't look up, didn't like the way they looked at you. "That all?" "No." "Then why?" John set the knife down, because no one else did. She watched him, her hands folded tight. "I ain't yours to fix." "Didn't say you were." "I ain't ever gonna be anyone's wife again." "Didn't ask you to be." Silence again. She turned to leave, but paused. "You lost someone." "My wife, then the child." "What happened?" He stared at the knife. "Fire, winter, my fault." And that was all either of them said that night. But something in the room shifted. The air didn't feel as thin. The silence didn't hurt so bad. Ruth didn't run. She stayed through winter. She helped build new fencing when the snow cleared. She cut her hair short and wore trousers when she worked. The child came in early spring, a girl. She screamed through the birth but never once asked for help. John stayed by the door and waited, sweat on his brow like he'd been the one pushing life through. When the baby came, Ruth held it close and didn't cry until the morning after, when John handed her a carved rattle and said nothing. They named her Mercy. By summer, the land began to breathe again. Rain came, crops stirred, but word traveled. Men had seen Holt ride into Abilene and leave with what they'd wanted for themselves. Kavanaugh's brothers weren't forgiving men. They weren't the kind to forget a debt paid in land and blood. And John, though stronger now, knew peace was a short reprieve. The past has long legs, and vengeance never sleeps. The sun hung lower that year, or seemed to. Summer settled over the ridge like a hot breath, heavy with the scent of cedar and dry wheat. John worked the fields with new urgency, his hands leathered and back bent from long days. Ruth worked too. She tied Mercy to her back with a length of feed cloth and moved through the dirt like she'd been born to it. No wedding ring, no soft dress, no cooed lullabies, just the steady rhythm of survival. They didn't speak of what they were to each other. She slept in the main room still, Mercy in a cradle John had built from a broken barrel. At night, the child would cry, and Ruth would nurse her by the window, staring out toward the hills where coyotes howled and men hid in brush, waiting for the right night to come calling. In town, rumors churned. That Holt had taken a girl for free, that she'd bewitched him, that he'd burned his own farm just to come back meaner. Ruth became the whisper behind every jealous man's drink and the excuse some boys gave their wives for staying out too long. John heard it from the blacksmith, heard it from the preacher who came up once a month with sour wine and unwelcome prayers. "You bringin' sin into the world, Holt," he'd said, eyeing Mercy like she was the devil's own mistake. John didn't answer. He didn't go to the post office anymore. He stopped trading in town unless desperate. The lines on his face deepened. Then came the rider. Late August, dusk, a single horseman on a red mare with hooves like thunder. Ruth saw him first. She was drawing water, Mercy asleep in a basket near the cottonwood. She dropped the pail and went still. Her eyes narrowed. "Who's that?" she asked when John stepped out with the axe. He didn't answer. The rider wore a vest of oilskin and a hat tipped low. His boots were polished, but the rifle strapped across his saddle wasn't for show. He dismounted slowly, hand on the stock. "You John Holt," he called. John didn't nod. "Name's Elias Kavanaugh," the rider said. "I believe you knew my brother." Ruth stepped in front of the child's basket, shoulders tight. "I didn't know him," John said, "but I buried him." "Funny thing," Elias said, stepping closer. "He didn't leave a will, but he had property, a wagon, some coin, and a girl." Ruth's hands curled into fists. "She's not property," John said. Elias smiled, slow and cruel. "No, but I reckon she's got something that belongs to us. That bastard baby she's got, that's Kavanaugh blood, makes her ours." John's voice didn't rise. "You want to leave now?" Elias tilted his head. "That a threat, old man?" "No, it's a kindness." A pause, then Elias spat and turned. "This ain't over, we'll be back." He mounted and rode out, dust rising behind him like a trail of poison. That night John loaded the rifle and kept it beside the door. Ruth didn't ask questions. She checked the shutters. She salted the steps. The next day they found the fence cut, 2 goats missing. The day after, their well had been poisoned with a rotting cat. Mercy coughed all through the night from smoke someone had tried to blow down the chimney. No flames, but enough to choke a child. John knew the tactics: slow war, bleed a man until he's too weak to fight. The law was too far and too bought to bother with. The Kavanaugh boys had reach and worse, patience. Ruth wasn't scared, she was angry. She stopped wearing dresses even in the heat. She tied her hair back like a soldier and started sleeping with a knife under the cradle. Mercy took to silence like the land around her. No cries, just wide eyes that tracked movement like a hawk. John saw something in Ruth begin to harden. "I won't lose another one," she said one night, voice low. "You won't," he said. "I buried 2 already. The second one didn't even breathe right, just blue and still. I put him in the river." John didn't ask about the first. Ruth looked at him. "You sure you want this? Me and her and whatever else comes hunting." He didn't hesitate. "I want the truth, that's all." She looked away then, tears she didn't let fall trembling in her voice. "You already got it." For 2 weeks they waited. Nothing came, no rider, no fire, no sound but the wind and Mercy's shallow sleep. Then on a night when the stars flickered behind thick clouds, Ruth woke with her heart pounding. The dogs, 2 mutts John had raised since pups, were silent. Too silent. She shook John. "Someone's here." He was up before the words left her mouth. Rifle, boots. They moved like one thing now, like 2 wolves tethered by the same hunger. Mercy stayed asleep. A figure crossed the field, low and fast. John fired once, missed. The figure vanished. Another came from the side, then another. "They're testing us," Ruth said, jaw clenched. "Let them." But the men didn't come all the way in, just circled, through rocks. One left a doll's head on the porch. Ruth picked it up and snapped it in 2, hands shaking. "You ever kill a man?" John asked the next day as they buried what was left of the dog. Ruth stared at the dirt. "No," she said, "but I watched one die with my teeth in his throat." John didn't doubt it. The next night Ruth waited alone on the porch. Mercy slept behind the fire, and John was in the barn, setting traps with old bare wire. Midnight passed. Then came the snap. A scream followed, high and hoarse, full of blood. John ran. Ruth was already at the door with her rifle drawn. One of the Kavanaugh boys lay in the brush, caught in the wire. His leg was nearly severed, bones showing. He gurgled something, but John didn't hear it. Ruth raised the rifle. He raised a hand, gasping. Please, the boy wheezed. Don't. Ruth didn't speak. She didn't blink. She looked at John. You want to bury another one? She asked. He shook his head. So she pulled the trigger. The body fell still. The air went quiet. John dug a hole that night under the pecan tree. Ruth didn't help. She sat with Mercy and hummed something broken. I ain't going back to what I was, she said. You're not. I won't be used again. You won't. And in the dark, with the smell of blood and dirt fresh on the wind, she looked up at him, not as a woman asking for rescue, but as something risen from ashes, too sharp now to bend. We end this, she said. John nodded. They didn't sleep. By morning, they were packing. They left before dawn, fire smoldering in the hearth and no note left behind. John strapped Mercy to his back. Ruth rode with the shotgun balanced across her knees. The mule pulled a cart with salted meat, one barrel of water, and a crate lined with rags, inside which sat all that remained of John's past life, 2 wedding bands, a folded letter in his dead wife's hand, and the land deed he'd never signed over. They headed west, not to escape, but to draw the fire out. Ruth said it plainly, if they want us, they'll follow, and I want them tired when they get here. She, taken to war like it was the only thing that ever made sense. Her shoulders stopped trembling, her jaw set firm. She didn't ask permission anymore. She didn't seek comfort. By the time they crossed Red Crow Pass, the baby had learned to stay quiet even through storms. They stopped only to rest the mule or refill water from creeks where frogs sang and bones turned white under current. John made campfires only when the wind was strong enough to carry the smoke away. Ruth took watch every other night, eyes fixed on the dark with the cold patience of someone who'd slept beside worse than wolves. By the 4th week, they reached the Badlands. The earth there was sharp, red and white stone rising like the spines of giants long dead. Wind hissed through the gulches and carried whispers across the ridgelines, half bird call, half something older. Few folk lived there. The ones who did knew better than to ask questions. They took shelter in an old mine shack abandoned by silver men who died with dreams in their teeth. Ruth swept the floor, cleared nests, and posted nails across the windows. John fixed the roof with tar and old canvas. Mercy, now crawling, picked her way through the dirt with a solemn quiet too heavy for a child her age. They stayed through early frost. Ruth caught rabbits. John traded what pelts he had left at a crooked trading post where everything smelled of rot gut and oil. Word traveled even there. You the one got a girl from Abilene? A man asked once, sharp-eyed and pale. John didn't answer. He didn't need to. The man tipped his hat, but his smile was thin. They're looking, boys from back east. Want her back bad. That night John rode hard across shale back to the shack. He didn't tell Ruth what he heard. He didn't have to. She was already packing the child's things. I heard a hawk cry 3 times, she said. Always means someone's about to bleed. They moved again, south this time into canyon country. The rock swallowed sound, echoed hoofbeats like a drum. Days passed, then a week. Still no riders, still no sign. But the air changed. Ruth noticed it in Mercy first. She's twitching in her sleep, she whispered. She never twitches. John checked the rifle, re-greased the sights. They kept riding. Then came the ambush. It happened on a bend near Devil's Fork, where the trail narrowed between 2 cliff walls. John was leading the mule, Mercy strapped tight. Ruth rode rear, watching the ridge. The shot came low, aimed at the animal. The mule screamed and buckled. 3 men appeared from the rock, faces wrapped in kerchiefs, rifles leveled. John Dove rolled, drew. One shot took a man in the chest. Ruth fired from the saddle, clipped the second through the eye. The third ran, she chased. John pulled Mercy free, dragged her behind a boulder. The child didn't cry, not even when blood splattered across her blanket. When Ruth returned, she was panting, blood on her hands. Dead, she said, wasn't Elias, but his colors. They stripped the dead, burned the bodies, took the bullets, left the boots. Ruth didn't speak until long after dark. You know what that means, don't you? John nodded. Scouts. They're closing in. He didn't argue. He watched Mercy sleep and remembered the feel of ashes in his mouth, of bones breaking in fire. He'd buried one family already. He wouldn't bury another. The next day, they found a place to make a stand. It was an old mission, long abandoned, roof torn open by time and wind, but its walls were stone, thick and narrow-slit, the kind of place built to survive sieges. They spent a week preparing. John dug trenches, Ruth set traps, Mercy watched from a sling on her mother's back, her little fists always clenched. At night they practiced movements, positions, reloads. Ruth kept her knife close. I want him to see my eyes when he dies, she said once. You think it'll be him? He won't send boys to do what he wants most. She was right. The riders came at dawn. 6 men, one wore a red vest. The sun hit the badge pinned to it. Elias. They came slow, deliberate. Ruth stood atop the mission, rifle over one shoulder, hair braided like a rope. John knelt beside the doorway, pistol in each hand. Ruth, Elias called. We came for what's ours. She didn't answer. Give her up, Holt. She ain't worth this. She's worth everything, John said. Then the silence broke, a shot, a scream. Ruth had fired first. What followed was not a gunfight, it was execution. John took 2 in the legs before they reached the walls. Ruth shot one through the jaw as he tried to climb the side. Elias fired blindly, fury in his voice. You think this makes you a man, Holt. She's just a whore with a belly full of filth. That's when Ruth dropped from the wall. She didn't scream. She didn't hesitate. She walked through dust and bullet smoke with a knife in one hand and a rifle in the other. Elias saw her too late. The rifle jammed. She didn't need it. They met just inside the chapel arch, where the sun broke through the shattered roof like judgment. He tried to draw. She lunged. The knife sank into his throat. He staggered, gurgled, clutched at her wrist. She twisted. His knees hit the stone. Not yours, she said. Then she pulled it free. He died staring up at her like he'd seen God and been unimpressed. John watched from the shadows, blood on his shoulder, one pistol empty. Ruth didn't cry. She just dropped the knife, stepped back into the light, and reached for her daughter. Mercy cooed. The wind shifted. It was over. They buried the bodies behind the chapel, said no prayers. Ruth burned Elias' badge. When they rode away 3 days later, they didn't head back east. They didn't need land. They didn't need a deed. They had each other, and they had the truth of what they'd done. Not for justice, not even for vengeance, but for something harder to name. Redemption, maybe. They rode until the world turned green again. Past broken homesteads and sun-bleached markers, they crossed into the edge of Comanche land, where the rivers ran cold and pine trees clung to the mountains like survivors. The days were long and quiet. The baby grew heavier. Ruth rode with Mercy swaddled against her chest, eyes scanning every tree line. John kept the rifle across his lap, even when he slept. They didn't speak of what they'd done, didn't say Elias' name or recall the burning chapel behind them. But the silence changed. It wasn't fear anymore. It was weight. A shared thing, thick and real like muscle built over bone. A week into the hills, they came across a woman on the trail. She stood alone beside a broken wagon, its axle cracked, her hands bloodied from trying to lift it. Two children sat behind her, thin, blank-eyed, with sores around their mouths. She raised a knife as they approached, but her hand shook too hard to grip it right. "I ain't begging," she rasped. John raised his hands. "We're not talking, just passing." Ruth dismounted. "You from here?" she asked. The woman nodded. "Used to be, lost my husband near Laramie. Thought we'd find work back this way. Wagon wheel gave out, been 2 days, kids haven't eaten." Ruth didn't ask for proof. She handed over jerky, then led the mule forward. "We'll ride with you to the next town," she said. The woman blinked, then lowered the knife. John said nothing. By the time they reached Cedar Hollow, the kids had started to smile again. The town wasn't much, just a mill, 2 cabins, and a church, but it had food and it had people, and no one asked questions. The woman's name was Ella. Her children were David and Bate. When they tried to say goodbye, Ruth didn't let them. "We've got room," she said, motioning toward the cabin they'd taken over, half collapsed but dry. "And hands make light work." John knew then they weren't running anymore. They were building something. He didn't know what or how long it'd last, but he felt it. They repaired the cabin, raised new fence. John trapped fur for trade. Ruth helped Ella with sewing in the small garden behind the church. Mercy began to laugh, first once, then often. It was the sound of wood smoke and fresh bread in days that passed without fear. But nothing lives clean forever. One night after supper, a rider came in from the east, dust on his coat, a U.S. Marshal star on his chest. He didn't ask to come in, just knocked once, then entered. "You John Holt?" he asked, voice hard. John stood slowly. "Used to be." The marshal held out a folded paper. "Warrant for murder, 3 counts, name's Elias Kavanaugh at the top." John didn't flinch. He come looking for a pregnant girl he'd kept in chains. "You call that murder?" "I don't call it anything, but I'm here to bring you back." Ruth stepped forward. "If he goes," she said, "I go." The marshal looked at her, then at the child on her hip. "That's your girl." "No," Ruth said, "she's mine." The man hesitated. The air thickened. "You fight back," he said slowly, "and I'll bring you in dead, but I got no wish to orphan another baby." John looked at Ruth. He didn't say goodbye, just kissed Mercy's forehead and walked out with his hands open. The marshal tied his wrists. They left at dawn. The town stood quiet. Ruth stood on the porch, not crying. She didn't cry when he disappeared over the ridge. Didn't cry when winter came and the child called out for him. But she didn't sleep much. She waited. And when spring arrived, she packed her things. Told Ella to keep the house. Told Mercy they were going on a journey. She rode alone this time, through wind and snowmelt, through border towns where men eyed her like a curse. She followed rumor and whisper, found out where they held him. Not a prison. A labor camp outside Fort Elbridge. They kept him in chains, had him breaking stone from sunup to dusk. The kind of sentence they gave men they didn't expect to live through. When she arrived, she waited until the guard changed. She entered the supply shed, knifed one man in the gut, took his uniform. That night she walked straight into the camp. Found John in the quarry, bleeding from his hands, too tired to raise his head. He looked up. "Thought you'd leave," he said. She crouched beside him. "You should have known better." She unlocked his chains. He stood. Together they ran. They didn't stop until the sun came up, and the mountain cast its long shadow across the valley. Ruth turned to him, breathing hard. "This your redemption yet?" she asked. John looked at her, sun rising behind her back, light caught in the lines of her face, a child's blanket strapped across her shoulders. "No," he said, "but you are." She smiled once. Then they kept walking. Toward home. The high valley they settled in sat nestled between two black ridgelines, where snow held longer and the wind smelled like iron. Nobody came that far unless they meant to vanish. That was its appeal. Ruth didn't want visitors. John had no use for them. And Mercy, now nearly 2 years old, spoke only in murmurs and gestures, as if she too understood the danger of being known. They built again, not just shelter, but walls. A real home this time. Stones hauled from the riverbed, timber stripped from fallen spruce. It took them all summer. Ruth's hands bled, John's back cracked like old leather. But when it was done, they had something no fire could claim. A cabin that faced east, with a garden behind it and 3 graves beneath a bent cedar where Ruth placed river stones each time the snow melted. One grave held no bones, just a name carved in the old tongue. The child she drowned in silence, the one she never spoke of again. By fall, they had a cellar dug and shelves lined with jars. Ruth took to canning like it was sacred work. Mercy tottered through the doorway barefoot, cheeks full of apple slices, hair tangled with bark and old clover. John hunted. He came back one evening with a buck too large to drag alone, eyes hollowed from the chase. "You're limping," Ruth said. He sat with a grunt, got caught in a rock break, tendons tight. She knelt and unlaced the boot without asking. "Been 10 days since you slept right," she murmured. "I dream of it sometimes," he admitted. "The fire, the auction yard, the sound Elias made when you cut him." She didn't flinch. "You regret it?" she asked. "I regret letting you do it alone." They sat that way in the quiet, the air sharp with the smell of blood and pine pitch. He watched her hands, how they wrapped the cloth tight, how they didn't shake. "I'm not your debt," she said. "I know. I'm not your penance. I know that too." She leaned back, looked at him. "Then what am I?" He didn't answer for a long time. The wind blew in through the open door. Somewhere outside, an owl called. "You're what's left," he said. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away. That night, she lay beside him. For the first time, not out of fear or obligation, but because it was cold and because there was no more pretending they hadn't built something together from the bones of what the world tried to bury. Winter came like a siege. Heavy snows pinned the valley shut. They lived by candlelight and old firewood, their breath fogging the glass. Mercy grew talkative, soft-voiced and clever. She took to carving things, wood animals, dolls with strange eyes, and Ruth encouraged it. John fixed traps. He taught the child how to track rabbits, how to listen for the way wind moved through trees before a storm. But even in that cold silence, the past had teeth. One night, while Ruth was boiling water, and Mercy slept with her arms thrown wide like a small saint, John stood by the window and stared down the valley. "What is it?" Ruth asked. He didn't speak. Then she saw it too. Smoke. Thin, gray, rising too steady to be from a lightning strike. She took the rifle, he took the axe. They followed the trail at dawn, Ruth leading, John a step behind. It was a camp, small but recent, 3 men, all dead, frozen stiff around a fire that had long since gone out. Their necks bore marks of garrote wire. One had a map pinned to his chest with a dagger. Ruth pulled it free. Cedar Hollow, she read aloud. John's face darkened. They came looking. Somebody's still hunting. They didn't take anything from the bodies, left them for the crows. On the way back, Ruth was quiet. You think it's martial business? John asked. No, she said, this feels different. He looked at her. She clenched her jaw. This feels personal. And that scared her more than the law ever had. That night, she packed a rucksack with bullets and dried meat. You're not going alone, John said. You're not healed. I've been bleeding since the day they hung me for justice. I'll manage. She didn't argue. She let Mercy sleep in her arms one last time, then handed the child to John. If I don't come back in 3 days, you'll come back. She left before first light. John stayed by the door, rifle across his knees, Mercy on his lap. The child didn't cry, didn't even stir, just stared into the fire like she understood what the shadows meant. Ruth followed the ridge down through the shale and rockslide. She tracked the path of the men back past the river fork, past where snow turned to slush. Found a trail, small, tight, half-covered in leaves. A woman's trail. Small feet, light tread, but she moved fast. Ruth's heart turned cold. The tracker wasn't sent. She was drawn. When she reached the next pass, she found what she hadn't wanted to believe. A cairn freshly built, around it the tracks of a child. And beside it, etched into bark, a name she hadn't heard in years. Sarah. Her own. Not Mercy. Her real name. Buried by time and shame and silence. She stared at it until the sun rose. Then she knew. Whoever had killed the scouts, whoever had built that cairn, wasn't just hunting John. They were digging through Ruth's past, turning over graves she'd left unmarked. Someone from before Kavanaugh, from her family. Someone who'd seen her fall and wasn't done watching. She turned back fast, sprinted through brush and branch until her lungs burned. 3 days had passed. When she reached the cabin, the door was open. Blood in the snow. The fire was out. John was gone. Mercy was not. She sat in the corner, blanket around her, staring at the wall. And etched into that wall, above her head, were 5 words scorched deep into the wood. You took what was mine. Ruth fell to her knees. Not with grief, but with fury so thick it made her vision red. The past wasn't done, and neither was she. Ruth didn't bury the blood. She left it smeared across the cabin floor, froze it into the doorway where John had been taken. There were no tracks. Whoever had come knew how to cover a trail, how to move with the earth, not against it. But they'd made one mistake. They'd left the child. Not out of mercy. Out of cruelty. Ruth cleaned Mercy's face with melted snow. The girl didn't cry, just looked up with wide, waiting eyes. Ruth wrapped her tight in deer hide, tucked her under the hearthstones where it stayed warm